Welcome to Book Reviews, where we explore the best books across every genre. I'm Joanna McCann. I'm joined as always by Gerald LeBlanc. Don't forget to grab your free copy of the audiobook using the link in the description below. Let's get started. Okay, are we recording? All right, so today we are really going deep, and I mean deep, into a topic most people just aren't talking about.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's kind of hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. We're going to be exploring how technologies developed in the context of the Israeli occupation of Palestine are being used around the world.
And we're going to be drawing on some really insightful and frankly disturbing findings from Antony Loewenstein's book, The Palestine Laboratory. Have you had a chance to look at it?
I have, and let me tell you, it was a tough read, but incredibly eye-opening. Loewenstein doesn't shy away from the hard truths.
He really doesn't. Right out of the gate, he hits you with this quote from Benjamin Netanyahu about Europe, and it's a doozy.
Oh yeah, the one about Europe ending in Israel. I was floored when I read that.
It's a bold statement, to say the least. Europe must decide if it wants to live and prosper or wither and disappear. Europe ends in Israel. East of Israel, there's no more Europe.
It's like he's trying to redraw the map with his words.
Right. But then Loewenstein throws in this bit of irony. The EU is actually Israel's biggest trading partner.
Yeah.
So it's like Netanyahu is playing this double game, talking tough on the one hand, but maintaining these crucial economic ties on the other.
It makes you wonder who he's trying to convince.
Exactly. But it also highlights this really important point. Image matters. And that brings us to this whole concept of the Palestine Laboratory.
Yeah, that's a term that really jumped out at me. Can you unpack that a bit? What exactly did Loewenstein mean by that?
So imagine the occupied Palestinian territories as a kind of testing ground, a laboratory where new forms of surveillance and control are being constantly developed and refined.
Okay, I'm already getting some unsettling vibes here.
Yeah, it's pretty heavy stuff. We're talking drones so advanced they can practically read your mind, facial recognition that makes everything you've ever seen look like child's play, and spyware that can turn your phone into a listening device without you ever knowing.
I mean, some of this stuff sounds like it's straight out of a dystopian novel.
That's what I thought too. But Loewenstein backs it up with hard evidence. He talks about how Israeli companies were at the Paris Air Show using drone footage as promotional material.
Okay, that's pretty standard for defense contractors, right?
Sure. But here's the catch. The footage showed the killing of Palestinian civilians, including children.
Wait, seriously? They were using footage of civilian casualties as a selling point?
Apparently so. And that's where it gets really disturbing. It's one thing to develop these technologies, but to then turn around and market them using images of death and destruction. That crosses a line that most other defense contractors wouldn't even go near.
It really makes you question the ethics at play here.
Absolutely. And it speaks to this larger point that Loewenstein keeps coming back to. This isn't just about selling technology, it's about selling a narrative of Israeli expertise, of battle-tested solutions.
And after 9/11, that narrative became especially appealing to a world suddenly terrified of terrorism.
Right. With the rise of the war on terror, countries were desperate for ways to keep their citizens safe. And Israel was ready to offer its services.
But what Loewenstein makes clear is that these technologies were developed in a very specific context, one marked by occupation and resistance.
Exactly. And that's where the whole thing takes on a whole new level of complexity. You're essentially taking tools designed for one of the most morally fraught situations imaginable and exporting them to the world.
And I'm guessing that doesn't always end well. So where does all this technology actually end up? Loewenstein gives any specifics?
Oh yeah, he gives tons of examples. It's kind of like he takes you on this world tour
Okay.
of all the places where this stuff is popping up.
Gotcha.
And it's not exactly, Disneyland. He starts with Sri Lanka,
Okay.
where the government used Israeli drones to crush the Tamil resistance. Brutal stuff.
Yeah, that conflict doesn't always get the attention it deserves, but the human rights abuses were really horrific. It's just mind-blowing to think that technologies developed in one conflict zone could then be used to fuel violence halfway across the world.
Yeah, and tragically, it's not an isolated incident. Loewenstein then shifts gears a bit and takes us into this whole world of cyber surveillance.
Okay.
He talks about how Israeli companies have been selling really advanced spyware to like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And we're not just talking about monitoring what websites people are visiting.
Right.
This is spyware that can literally turn your phone into a spy in your pocket, recording your conversations, tracking your every move, accessing all your personal data.
Okay, now that's straight up creepy. I mean, I know people say, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. But this is different. It feels like a total invasion of privacy.
It is. And Loewenstein makes this really chilling connection to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And suggests that this kind of spyware might have played a role.
That is chilling. It really drives home the point that this isn't some abstract threat, you know? We're talking about real people's lives being impacted, freedoms being eroded.
Absolutely. And it's happening closer to home than you might think. Loewenstein also talks about how Israeli surveillance technologies are being used right here in the EU.
Really? Here in the EU?
Yep. Particularly when it comes to controlling migration. Think high-tech border fences, facial recognition systems, all that. There's even evidence that Frontex, the EU border agency, is working directly with Israeli companies.
Wow, I had no idea the EU was so involved in this. So with all this technology spreading like wildfire, is anyone even trying to stop it?
They are. Loewenstein actually introduces us to this really fascinating guy, Itay Mack. He's an Israeli human rights lawyer, and he's basically taking on the entire Israeli defense industry.
Wow, an insider turned activist. That's pretty remarkable. It really speaks to the complexity of this issue, you know?
Totally.
Yeah.
And Mack is part of this growing movement of individuals and organizations who are calling out what Loewenstein calls the occupation industry. They're filing lawsuits, leaking documents, organizing protests, really putting pressure on the people and companies that are profiting from these technologies.
It's inspiring in a way, you know? Even in the face of these seemingly unstoppable forces, there are people willing to stand up and fight back.
Exactly. It shows that change is possible. And this fight is much bigger than just one region or one type of technology. Loewenstein even draws this really thought-provoking parallel between Palestine and Kashmir.
Interesting.
In what way? He argues that the Indian government is using a lot of the same tactics and technologies to control the Kashmiri population that we see being used in Palestine.
You know, I wouldn't have necessarily made that connection on my own, but when you lay it out like that, it makes a lot of sense.
Right. The surveillance, the suppression of dissent, it's all too familiar. And this is where Loewenstein really brings it home for a lot of people, because he then pivots to the United States.
The United States. How does the U.S. fit into all of this?
Well, it turns out that U.S. law enforcement agencies, especially along the U.S.-Mexico border, have been using more and more Israeli technology and tactics.
Wait, really? I had no idea there is that kind of connection between U.S. law enforcement and Israel.
It's deeper than you might think. Loewenstein found that U.S. law enforcement officials have been going to Israel for training for years now, learning about everything from surveillance techniques to crowd control methods.
It's one thing to hear about this technology being used in other countries, but to think that it's being adopted here by our own law enforcement agencies, that's really unsettling.
It is, and it goes back to that point about narrative. Loewenstein argues that Israel has done a really effective job at marketing themselves as a leader in counterterrorism, like the Harvard is anti-terrorism, as one U.S. Capitol Police chief put it.
So they've managed to package their experience, their expertise in control and surveillance, and sell it to other countries as a solution to their security concerns.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole issue so incredibly complicated. It's not a clear-cut case of good guys and bad guys, or even good technology versus bad technology. It's about understanding the nuances of power dynamics, how certain narratives take hold, and how technologies developed in one context can have these ripple effects across the globe, often with unintended and deeply troubling consequences.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? It really does. It's kind of overwhelming when you start to connect the dots, you know? You see these patterns popping up everywhere you look.
Yeah, it's easy to feel powerless in the face of it all. But that's why I keep coming back to people like Itay Mack. They remind us that we're not just passive bystanders in all of this.
Right. He's not just sitting back and complaining. He's actively fighting back against these powerful institutions.
And he's not alone. There are so many other people out there, activists, journalists, lawyers, who are working tirelessly to expose these systems, to hold the people in power accountable. It takes a lot of courage to stand up like that, but it's so important.
It gives me hope, you know, because reading Loewenstein's book, it's easy to feel like the Palestine laboratory, as he calls it, is just this unstoppable machine. But there are people out there who are saying, no, we're not going to let this stand.
Exactly. And what really struck me was how Loewenstein connects this all back to the United States. I mean, who would have thought that what's happening in Palestine would have any bearing on what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border?
I know, right? But when you really think about it, it makes sense. It's like this technology, this mentality is almost becoming a default response to any kind of perceived threat or unrest.
It's about control, you know? And it doesn't matter if you talk about Palestinians in the West Bank or migrants at the U.S. border. The underlying logic is scarily similar.
It makes you realize that we all have a stake in this fight. Because if this technology can be used to target those groups, what's to stop it from being used against any one of us?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's why I think this whole conversation boils down to one crucial point. Technology itself isn't inherently good or bad. It's just a tool. It's how it's developed, how it's marketed, and ultimately how it's used that makes all the difference.
I like that. It's not about demonizing technology. It's about being aware of the choices we're making, both as individuals and as a society, about how we want to use it.
Exactly. And that starts with being informed, asking those tough questions, where does this technology come from? Who stands to profit from it? And most importantly, what are the potential consequences of its use?
It's a call to action for all of us, isn't it? To be more critical, more engaged, to really think about the impact our choices are having on the world around us.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and expect others to solve these problems for us. It's on all of us to demand better, to push for a future where technology is used to empower people, not to control them.
That's a powerful message to end on. It's a lot to unpack, but I think that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Make us stop and really think about the world we're creating.
For sure.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive, to say the least. Thank you so much for taking the time to break all of this down for us today. I think we all learned a lot.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Be sure to check back next week for a brand new deep dive. And that's our summary for today. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to grab your free copy of the audiobook using the link in the description below. See you next time.